Imagine a man who could stun India's parliament into silence with a single sentence, yet died without ever holding high office. A scholar with a German PhD who chose dusty village meetings over the comfort of Delhi salons, a freedom fighter who helped shake an empire, and then spent the rest of his life fighting the very leaders he once called comrades. This is the story of Ram Manohar Lohia, the man who refused to bow, even to his own side. To understand how a quiet boy from a small town became the loudest conscience of a nation, we have to start in a cramped house in Akbarpur in 1910 under the heat of a colonial sun. The first sound he heard in life was not lullabies, but arguments. Not gentle domestic arguments, political ones. His father, Hiralal, was a lawyer, but the law was just his day job. His real passion was the struggle against the British Raj. Evenings in that house were filled with whispered discussions about secret meetings, banned pamphlets, and the latest arrest of some local leader. Men with tired eyes and rough hands came and went, bending over a smoky lantern, tracing the map of a free India that did not yet exist. Little Ram Manohar would sit in the corner, eyes wide, absorbing every word. But politics was not the first thing to cut into his heart. It was loss. When he was still a child, his mother died. There was no great drama to it, no heroic sacrifice, just the quiet, brutal emptiness that follows death in a poor, colonized country. A body wrapped in white, hushed murmurs, the smell of incense, a boy trying to understand why the world had suddenly shrunk. From that day, the house was quieter, except when it came to the struggle. His father did not put away his politics, he doubled down on it. For Hiralal, the British were not just rulers. They were the distant cold force that could decide whether a village had food, whether a peasant kept his land, whether his own son would grow up free or frightened. He took Ram with him to political meetings, to protests, to the busy chaos of Banaras and other towns where the nationalist movement was gathering fire. The boy watched as men shouted, "Inquilab Zindabad," and "Vande Mataram," and were beaten down by lathas that cracked on skulls like dry wood. He learned very early that in India, even shouting could be a crime. One image burned itself into his memory: a line of peasants wrapped in coarse cotton standing silently in front of a British magistrate. Their crime: refusing to pay a tax on the most basic thing they needed to live: salt. Salt, the taste of every meal, the mark of hospitality, and a source of revenue for a distant empire that did not know the names of the villages it drained. That quiet fury stayed with him. Years later, his PhD thesis in Berlin would be on precisely this: the salt tax in India. But for now, it was just a boy's wound, not yet a weapon. At school, Ram was not the loudest, but he was the one who asked dangerous questions. Why do we study British kings but not our own rebels? Why is our language treated as inferior to English? Why does the headmaster lower his voice when he speaks of Gandhi? He was clever, sharp, restless. Teachers praised his mind but warned him, "If you keep talking like this, you will get into trouble." Trouble for him was not a possibility. It was a destiny he was already walking towards. As he grew older, his world expanded. From Akbarpur to Banaras, from the narrow lanes of a small town to the crowded ghats where the Ganges carried away the ashes of the dead and the whispers of the living. Banaras was tradition and defiance wrapped together: temples and textbooks, Sanskrit chants and secret meetings. There, as a student, he saw two Indias clashing every day, the ancient and the awakening. On one side, people bowed their heads before statues and rituals. On the other, they stood up in meetings and refused to bow before an empire. Ram Manohar belonged instinctively to the second. He read everything he could lay his hands on: history, economics, philosophy, literature. He devoured the speeches of Gandhi and the writings of European thinkers. He watched, almost breathless, as the non-cooperation movement surged across the country like a tidal wave, and then crashed as Gandhi called it off after the violence at Chari Chara. For many, that was a moment of confusion. For young radicals like Lohia, it was a moment of clarity. This struggle was not going to be simple. It would be full of advances and retreats, moral stands, and strategic compromises. Already, in his teenage mind, a question formed that would haunt him his whole life. How far can you bend in politics before you break your principles? That question would one day put him on a collision course with a man he would both admire and oppose: Jawaharlal Nehru. Before their paths crossed, however, Ram had to leave India. It sounds almost like a betrayal. A nationalist son boarding a ship to Europe, heading to the very continent from which his country's rulers came. But for Lohia, Europe was not escape. It was reconnaissance. He went first to Calcutta, then farther afield before finally reaching Berlin. Berlin in the late 1920s and early 1930s was electric and terrifying at the same time. It was the city of smoky cafes where intellectuals argued until dawn, of packed lecture halls, and of streets trembling under the boots of brown-shirt mobs. In the morning, Ram attended classes, studied economics and politics, refined his German until he could argue in it as sharply as in Hindi. In the afternoon and evenings, he walked through streets where the future of Europe was being decided in brick-barricaded clashes and torch-lit parades. He watched the slow, sickening rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, not as history but as daily news. Posters, slogans, hate wrapped in the language of destiny. In India, he had seen colonial arrogance. In Germany, he saw what ideological fanaticism could do to a modern state. He understood that brutality did not only wear a red coat and a British crown, it could also wear a brown shirt and wave a flag of its own. In student circles and political meetings, he found another world. Socialists, anti-fascists, exiled activists from many countries. He argued with them late into the night, turning ideas into weapons and questions into obsessions. What kind of freedom does a country really need? Is political independence enough if social and economic chains remain? If the British leave and Indian landlords and industrialists take their place, is that victory or just a change of jailers? He threw himself into his research on the salt tax in India, not as a dry academic topic, but as a symbol. For him, salt was the perfect example of how an empire could turn even the most basic human need into an instrument of control. Each statistic he wrote into his thesis was tied, in his memory, to the faces of peasants he had seen back home. But time was running out. The Germany he was living in was changing rapidly and brutally. The Nazis tightened their grip. Books were burned, professors disappeared. Languages, races, beliefs, everything was being sorted into categories of pure and dangerous. For an Indian student who spent his nights with socialists and his days criticizing imperialism, the atmosphere grew heavy. He could feel it in the way conversation stopped when certain people entered the room, in the way some of his friends suddenly began to speak in praise of order and national pride, in the way fear crept into academic spaces that once prided themselves on open debate. He finished his PhD in 1932, defending a thesis that dissected British colonial policy with surgical precision right in the heart of a European power sliding toward its own form of madness. And then he made a choice that would change his life and India's. He could have stayed. With his intelligence and Western education, he could have become a comfortable scholar, perhaps even a respected professor in Europe, or a bureaucrat in British India. Many would have said that was the sensible path. Instead, he turned his back on the career ladder laid out for him and boarded a ship home, carrying in his suitcase a doctoral degree, and in his mind a storm of ideas about socialism, freedom, and justice. The world he sailed back to was not the same one he had left. In India, the freedom struggle had grown fiercer. Gandhi was not just a name in newspapers anymore. He was a force that could shut down cities with a call, send millions marching to the sea to make illegal salt, or bring spinning wheels into the heart of politics. And in this churning ocean of movements, protests, and ideological battles, Ram Manohar Lohia stepped ashore with one burning conviction: political independence was necessary, but it was not enough. He joined the Indian National Congress, the flagship of the freedom struggle. But he did not enter it as a silent follower. He entered like a surgeon entering a crowded hospital, ready to start cutting away the rot. It was within the Congress that he first truly encountered the man who would become his greatest rival and reluctant mirror, Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru was already a star, Western-educated, elegant, articulate, draped in charisma and prison sentences. To the world, he was the future prime minister in waiting. To young radicals, he was also something else. The man who spoke of socialism from Congress platforms, who dreamed of planning, industry, and a modern scientific India. When Lohia first heard Nehru speak, there was admiration, even excitement. Here was someone who spoke the language of progress, not just of piety, someone who could talk of heavy industry and class struggle in the same breath as civil disobedience and khadi. But beneath the admiration, Lohia sensed a problem, something small at first, like a crack in a statue, barely visible but growing every day. He felt that Nehru's socialism was still too comfortable with centralized power, too trusting of the idea that a strong state, led by wise men, could solve the misery of millions. He feared that after the British, a new elite might simply take over the same machinery of rule, dressing it in the clothes of freedom. For Lohia, true socialism had to begin from below, from the villages, from the oppressed castes, from the people who did not speak English, who did not attend elegant conferences, who could not write articles in polished newspapers. This disagreement did not explode immediately. It simmered. On the surface, they were comrades. Nehru, the established leader, Lohia, the fiery young intellectual. He was drawn into the inner workings of the party, and in 1934 he became one of the founders of the Congress Socialist Party, the left-wing group within the Congress that wanted to push the struggle further, not just against the British, but against inequality itself. For the first time, Lohia was no longer just a critic or a student. He was an organizer, a strategist, a man shaping events rather than just observing them. The Congress Socialist Party was a rebellion within a rebellion, a challenge to both the British Empire and to the comfortable middle class leadership of the nationalist movement. It demanded land redistribution, workers' rights, an end to caste oppression, and a clear socialist direction for the future Indian state. Inside Congress meetings, debates turned sharper. Should the party focus solely on driving the British out, or also on tearing down the feudal system at home? Should the language of the movement be the English of elites, or the Hindi and regional tongues of workers and peasants? Should power, after independence, flow downward, or concentrate in the hands of a small circle in Delhi? Lohia was relentless. He spoke fast, argued fiercely, refused to soften his words even when older leaders frowned. He was not impressed by the glow of prestige or the aura of sacrifice. He looked at results, at structures, at who gained and who remained invisible. In him, Nehru must have seen both an ally and a threat, someone who shared his socialist vocabulary but challenged his assumptions, a mind too sharp to be easily absorbed, too restless to be content with half measures. The rivalry that would define much of Lohia's later life began not as a clash of egos but as a clash of visions. Meanwhile, outside the conference halls and committee rooms, the clock of history was ticking louder. The 1930s were drawing to a close. Fascism was on the march in Europe. War was brewing. In India, the gap between the cries of starving peasants and the speeches of politicians grew more painful to Lohia each day. He knew something with a terrifying clarity. The decisions made in these few years, about the nature of the freedom struggle, about leadership, about the economic and social path India would take, would shape the lives of hundreds of millions for generations. Time was not an abstract idea for him. It was a limit. He did not have a lifetime of leisurely reforms to work with. The British would not stay forever. When they left, whatever structure was in place could harden like wet cement. If it was unjust, it would trap his country for decades. And so, as the 1930s bled into the 1940s, Ram Manohar Lohia found himself standing on a narrow bridge between worlds, between village India and European radicalism, between Gandhi's moral politics and Nehru's modernist dreams, between the fight against foreign rulers and the looming fight against domestic injustice. He had entered politics. Now politics was about to enter war. And as sirens began to wail in European cities and British soldiers marched through Indian streets in the name of a distant king, Lohia knew one thing. His real battle had barely begun. Independence is only a few years away when Ram Manohar Lohia is forced to live like a fugitive, slipping from village to village in the dark, hunted by his own government. While the man destined to be India's first prime minister debates policy in guarded rooms, Lohia is running an illegal press from a mud hut, knowing that one careless word, one loose tongue could mean a bullet or a noose. The country is racing toward freedom. Lohia is racing against time just to stay alive long enough to shape what that freedom will mean. The 1940s crash into his life with the violence of a storm. Britain drags India into the Second World War without even the courtesy of asking its leaders. One radio announcement from London, and suddenly Indian peasants are paying for a European war with their taxes. Indian soldiers are shipped to deserts and jungles they cannot even spell. And Indian cities are told to dim their lights and fear air raids for a king they have never seen. Inside the Indian National Congress, rage explodes, but so do disagreements. Some leaders, like Subhas Chandra Bose, have already broken away, searching for allies even among the enemies of Britain. Gandhi, always the moral compass, refuses to support Hitler or the Nazis, but insists that India cannot be a partner in a war for freedom while it remains a colony. Jawaharlal Nehru feels the darkness of fascism keenly. He is horrified by Hitler, worried that if the Axis powers win, the whole world will sink into a new kind of slavery. He wants to stand with the forces fighting fascism, but he also knows the chains on his own country clink just as loudly as those in Europe. And in the middle of this tangled web, Lohia and the Congress Socialists take an even sharper line. For them, there is no choosing between bad empire and less bad empire. Imperialism, whether British, German, or Japanese, is one system, ruled by the few over the many. Lohia argues that if India joins the war under British command, it will be fighting for the right of its own jailer to keep the keys. He says it bluntly, how can a slave fight for the freedom of his master? To Nehru, this sounds dangerously simplistic in a world on fire. To Lohia, the complexity is an excuse, a way to avoid the central demand that cannot be delayed any longer: complete, immediate, uncompromising independence. That word immediate is not an abstract slogan for him. It is a clock ticking in his head. He knows what the war means strategically. While Britain is fighting for survival in Europe and North Africa, its grip on India is weaker than it has ever been. If Indians move now, if they strike together, they can force history's hand. If they wait until the war is over and Britain is victorious, the empire might return stronger, more organized, more willing to crush dissent. The moment is dangerous. It is also the greatest opportunity in 2 centuries. In August 1942 in Bombay, that ticking clock becomes a roar. The All India Congress Committee gathers in a city thick with humidity and tension. Police in starched khaki line the streets. Spies blend into crowds. British intelligence files are bursting with one name: Ram Manohar Lohia, socialist, dangerous. Inside the meeting hall, the atmosphere is electric. Gandhi rises and utters a phrase that will echo through generations: do or die. Quit India. No more resolutions politely worded. No more begging for dominion status. The demand is simple. The British must leave now. The method is clear: mass civil disobedience, refusal to cooperate at any level. Lohia is there, among the young radicals who have been begging for precisely this moment. He feels something close to exultation and also a deeper, colder resolve. He knows the British will not walk away because of a speech. They will crush this movement as they have crushed others, with arrests, censorship, bullets. The question is, will India be ready to keep fighting when the leaders are behind bars? Within hours, the crackdown begins. Almost the entire top leadership of the Congress, Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, is arrested in swooping night raids. The intent is clear: cut off the head and the body will collapse. But the British have underestimated the socialists. For years, Lohia and his comrades in the Congress Socialist Party have been quietly building cells, training cadres, creating networks that do not depend on single leaders or visible offices. They are used to working in the shadows. Now the shadows are all that remain. Lohia goes underground. One day he is a public figure, writing, speaking, debating in open meetings. The next he is slipping through railway stations under false names, sleeping in spare rooms and cowsheds, changing his route every night, memorizing safe houses instead of committee resolutions. He helps organize strikes, distribute cyclo-styled leaflets, and coordinate sabotage. Not the terrorism of random violence, but targeted attacks on the machinery of imperial control, communication lines, supply chains, symbols of authority. In a hidden room in Bombay, he works with a tiny team to run an illegal radio station that defies British censorship, the Congress. Radio, that crackling lifeline operated by brave souls like Usha Mehta. Night after night, in a shaky voice distorted by primitive equipment and constant fear, they beam messages of resistance. Do not lose heart. The leaders are in prison, but the nation is awake. Outside, the colonial state hunts them with growing fury. Posters go up with rewards for information. Police informers sniff around printing presses and post offices. Files are opened in secret branches. Lohia, to be arrested on sight. Known to incite subversive activities. Considered very dangerous. He keeps moving. Luck runs with him for a while. Then, in May 1944, it runs out. He is captured. The arrest is not cinematic. No dramatic chase, no final rooftop escape. Just a tightening circle of information, one betrayal too many, a door kicked in, rough hands on his arms, and a journey in a dark van to a place that will scar him forever, Lahore Fort. If you want to understand what the British Empire really was, peel away the rhetoric and the pomp, and look into the cells of Lahore Fort. Here, thick stone walls sweat with heat. Iron rings are driven into damp floors. Men disappear into rooms and come out limping or not at all. It is not a prison in the ordinary sense. It is an instrument. Lohia is interrogated, beaten, humiliated. They want information, names of underground workers, locations of presses, routes of communication. They also want something more subtle, his surrender, a signed apology, a confession that Quit India was a mistake, that the British in these difficult wartime conditions are acting reasonably. What they get is a thin man with glasses, refusing to give names, refusing to call his struggle a crime, refusing even when the walls echo with the screams of other prisoners who have been here longer, whose resistance is breaking. He is not a physically imposing man. He is no warrior by upbringing, no soldier by profession. He is a scholar, a writer, an organizer. In that fortress stripped of words and audiences, he faces the naked question of how much pain a conviction can withstand. He survives, scarred but unbroken. 2 years later, with the war over and Britain exhausted, a new Labour government in London decides that it is time to begin letting go. Political prisoners in India are gradually released. Lohia steps out of British custody in 1946 into a country that is almost unrecognizable from the one he left when he went underground. The air is full of rumors and negotiations. The British are talking to the Congress High Command. The Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah is pressing the demand for Pakistan with ruthless clarity. Communal riots have already begun to tear cities apart. The Quit India slogan has shaken the empire, but it has not created a united vision of what comes after. Lohia returns to the political arena with the urgency of a man who knows how brutally the empire fights when cornered and how limited the time now is. Independence is close, but what kind of independence? In smoke-filled rooms in Delhi, Nehru, Patel, and other senior leaders argue with Viceroy Wavell and later Lord Mountbatten. They discuss transfer of power, constitution-making, the future shape of the Indian state. Lohia is not at that table. He is out in the streets, in public meetings, writing fierce articles, pushing for a different emphasis. He demands that independence must immediately tackle three monsters at once: colonial rule, economic exploitation, and caste oppression. He warns that if the Congress accepts freedom at any cost, even at the cost of partition, even at the cost of leaving untouched the landlords, princes, and industrialists who profited under the British, then India will wake up on the morning after independence with the same chains, just held by brown hands instead of white. Events, however, move with a cruel logic of their own. In 1947, the map of India is cut with a line that bleeds: partition. The idea that Lohia and many others had fought so desperately to avoid becomes reality in ink and corpses. Trains pull into stations filled not with passengers but with bodies. Rivers run red. Entire villages are emptied in a matter of days. People burning what they cannot carry, clutching small bundles, leaving behind homes where their families had lived for centuries. Lohia travels through some of these wounded landscapes. He sees with his own eyes what political solutions on paper look like when they explode in the lives of ordinary people. He is furious at the British, who used divide and rule for decades and then left a bomb behind as they walked away, at communal, organizations that poured petrol on every spark, and yes, at his own former comrades in top Congress and League leadership who, in his view, accepted partition too easily once it became the convenient path to office. Then, on 15th of August 1947, the flag of a free India rises over Delhi. Everywhere, people dance in the streets. Firecrackers burst. Old men weep. Children who have known nothing but the British as rulers suddenly hear the word Azadi, not as a dream, but as a fact. Lohia stands in this moment with emotions knotted together in a way that almost defies description. There is pride, of course. The boy from Akbarpur who grew up watching Lothas crack on protesting peasants is living in a country that is no longer officially ruled from London. Friends have died for this. He himself has been tortured for this. The right to raise the tricolor is not trivial. But there is also a deep, almost nauseating unease. He looks at the men now stepping into positions of power, Nehru as Prime Minister, Patel as Deputy, Rajendra Prasad and others in key roles. They are patriots, no doubt. They are men of sacrifice, of ideals, of prison records thicker than most books. Yet the machinery they are inheriting is the same colonial machinery, centralized bureaucracy, distant capital, police and administration, designed to control, not to serve. Landlords still own vast tracts. Big business holds sway. The caste system remains untouched, hiding behind polite phrases and social blindness. He cannot shake the sentence forming in his mind. This is not a revolution. It is a transfer of power. The key rival in his mental landscape is now no longer the British governor, but Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru talks of socialism. He sets up planning commissions, launches 5-year plans, dreams aloud of steel plants, dams, and research institutes. To the world, he is the face of a bold, modern, secular India, walking confidently into the future. But Lohia watches carefully and asks different questions. Whose socialism is this? One managed from the top by experts speaking English sitting in Delhi, or one built from the bottom up, village by village, empowering the poorest and the most oppressed, breaking the ancient chains of caste and privilege? Nehru believes sincerely that a strong central state can lift people out of misery. Lohia believes just as fiercely that a strong central state can become a new emperor unless it is constantly challenged from below. The lines between them, once faint, now become trenches. In the first years after independence, Lohia and his socialist comrades try for one last time to pull the Congress itself leftward. They argue in party forums, criticize the government's reluctance to carry out radical land reforms, expose the continued dominance of upper castes and big capital. But the Congress is changing. The party of agitation is becoming the party of power. For many of its leaders, the goal now is stability, development, recognition on the world stage. Street protests make bad headlines when you are the one sitting in the prime minister's chair. Nehru remains courteous in public but begins to lose patience with internal dissent that questions the entire direction of his project. The conflict between Lohia and Nehru ceases to be a disagreement within a family. It becomes open opposition. In 1948, the Congress Socialists make a decision as dramatic, in its own way, as Quit India had been 6 years earlier. They walk out. They leave the mighty Congress, the party that led the freedom struggle, the party that now controls the government, and form an independent socialist party. It is a breathtakingly high-risk move. They are giving up immediate influence, access to ministries, the chance to shape policy from the inside. They are stepping into the wilderness, hoping to build a powerful alternative in a country still intoxicated with the names and symbols of the old national movement. For Lohia, it is not a strategic gamble. It is a moral necessity. He cannot, will not lend the legitimacy of socialism to what he sees as half measures and compromises. If the price of integrity is exile from the corridors of power, he is prepared to pay it. Now the race against time takes a new form. If the Congress under Nehru dominates for too long, if its version of centralized, elite-driven socialist planning becomes normal, and then any challenge will be dismissed as irresponsible, unrealistic, or extreme, the habits of obedience to a single party, a single leader, could harden into something dangerously close to one-party rule. The first general elections of 1951-52 loom like a huge clock on the wall, one deadline. If by then the Socialist Party cannot prove that there is a real appetite in the country for an alternative, the label ineffective may stick forever. Lohia throws himself into organization with a ferocity that surprises even those who know him. There are no luxurious party offices, no fleets of cars, no donors writing fat checks. There are cramped rooms with faulty fans and piles of leaflets. There are endless train journeys in crowded compartments, nights spent on station benches, mornings of tea in chipped glasses with workers and students. He writes manifestos late into the night, his handwriting racing across the page. He argues in workers' unions, in peasant conferences, in cramped town halls where the electricity fails mid-sentence and candles have to be brought in. Everywhere he carries the same core message: freedom is not complete. Independence is not enough if half the country still lives in semi-slavery under debt, caste, and landlordism. A government that builds dams but ignores the village well is not revolutionary. It is decorating the jail. He does not spare Nehru personally either. Respect is there for Nehru's sacrifices, for his secularism, for his internationalism. But that respect does not stop Lohia from naming what he sees as hypocrisy, a leader who speaks of socialism abroad while tolerating old feudal structures at home, a Democrat who seems comfortable with his own party's overwhelming dominance. The elections come. Posters of Nehru's face are everywhere, the handsome, slightly melancholic profile with the Nehru cap, symbol of the new India. The Congress has organization, money, prestige, and above all, the advantage of having led the freedom struggle. The Socialist Party has very little of that. It has words, passion, and a few scattered strongholds. The results are brutal. The Congress sweeps to an overwhelming victory. Nehru becomes not just the first prime minister, but the unchallenged national leader, his party controlling parliament with a strength that would make many future dictators envious. The socialists gain some seats, some toeholds, some respect. But in the arithmetic of power, they are marginal. For many, this would be the moment to give up, to join the ruling party for the greater good, to accept that India has chosen its path and that all that remains is to advise politely from within. For Lohia, it is the opposite. The scale of the Congress victory, the sheer weight of Nehru's popularity, terrifies him. It confirms his worst fear, that democracy without a robust opposition can quietly slide into a soft form of authoritarianism where one party is always naturally in power and others exist only to decorate the ballot paper. He knows his time is limited, not in the sense of years on a calendar, though his health after years of prison and strain is not strong, but in the sense that political possibilities close. Once people begin to think that no one can defeat Congress, they stop trying. Once the first decade of independence passes under a single unchallenged leadership, habits form that may last for generations. If he wants to stop India from becoming a democracy with only one real voice, he has to move faster, speak sharper, dig deeper. He will reinvent not just his tactics, but his entire political language. If he cannot win power in parliament, he will try to win power over imagination, to make ordinary Indians see their own lives and their rulers in a new and unsettling light. Somewhere in that turbulent early 1950s dawn of a new republic, as Nehru settles into office and the Congress machines begin to hum smoothly, Ram Manohar Lohia is already sharpening the next set of weapons, radical ideas about caste, language, and inequality that will make him, in the years to come, not just Nehru's critic, but his most persistent, infuriating, and unforgettable rival. By the early 1950s, something almost unthinkable is happening in India's new parliament. Ram Manohar Lohia's microphone is silent, and Jawaharlal Nehru's voice fills the hall unchecked. One man has the state, the budget, the planning commission, the radio, the adoring headlines. The other has a rickety party office, a few loyal comrades, and the stubborn belief that history can still be turned. On paper, this rivalry is ridiculous. On the ground, Lohia is determined to make it lethal. He looks at the glittering promise of Nehru's India, dams rising like temples of modernity, 5-year plans written in flawless English, glossy speeches at the United Nations, and sees underneath a silent emergency. Villages still drowning in debt, women still trapped in unpaid labor, lower castes still stepping off pavements when upper castes walk past. For Lohia, every day that this contradiction continues is a day lost. And he is convinced that India cannot afford to lose even one. So he makes a radical decision. If he cannot match Nehru's power, he will attack Nehru's language. Not English as a set of words, but English as a symbol of class, of distance, of a ruling elite that talks about the poor in a tongue the poor cannot even understand. He begins to hammer home a message that sounds at first almost absurd in a country worshiping its new leaders. India may have become free, but the rulers still speak in the language of the rulers. In meetings packed with students, clerks, and small shopkeepers, he paints a brutal picture. A peasant walks 10 kilometers to the district office, clutching a crumpled petition, only to find that the file it belongs to lives in an English world. English notes, English orders, English signatures. His life is quite literally lost in translation. Lohia is not a crude language chauvinist. He is ruthlessly practical. He argues that if Parliament debates in a language that only a tiny slice of the population truly commands, then democracy is already tilted. If the courts dispense justice in the tongue of a former empire, then justice itself is half denied. So he demands a swift, time-bound shift. Within a set number of years, India must move from English dominance to Indian languages, Hindi at the center, regional languages in the states, while fiercely protecting linguistic diversity and minority tongues. He knows this will be misread, and it is. Nehru, suspicious of any chauvinism that might trample non-Hindi regions, slows the process, promises gradual change, keeps English safe as a link language. Many liberals whisper that Lohia is playing with fire, that he will provoke language riots. Lohia's response is icy. The real riot, he says, is the daily exclusion of millions from real participation in public life, and that is already happening, quietly, in English. Here the rivalry with Nehru takes on a new edge. Nehru, Cambridge-educated, fluent in the polished diction of the imperial capital, sees no contradiction between his elite manner and his socialist goals. Lohia, trained in Europe but choosing to speak and write in earthy, direct Hindi, decides to make the contradiction the center of his attack. He is not just questioning policies, he is questioning the very class character of Nehru's state. But language is only one blade in his arsenal, and he knows it. There is a deeper, uglier monster that mocks every claim of equality: caste. In the early years after independence, many Congress leaders treat caste as an embarrassing social leftover that will slowly fade with education and economic growth. They speak of it in vague, gentle terms, as if naming it too clearly might be impolite. Lohia refuses this politeness like poison. He travels through Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Karnataka, Maharashtra, sitting under banyan trees and in dusty town halls, listening to people whose names rarely make it into official minutes. Landless laborers, washermen, barbers, weavers, scavengers. He forces himself to confront facts that more comfortable leaders gloss over. Entire villages where one caste cannot draw water from the main well. School classrooms where a child's place on the floor is decided by birth. Tea stalls where 2 glasses are kept aside for the untouchables, washed separately, stacked separately, shame stored in steel. Nehru speaks of scientific temper and democratic spirit. Lohia counts how many of the new MPs, ministers, judges, and top bureaucrats come from upper castes. The numbers make him furious. In speech after speech, he drives home one shocking, concrete idea: you cannot call a society democratic if its power pyramid is built almost entirely by the same 2 or 3 castes that dominated under the British, and before them, under the princes. He begins to champion what will, decades later, explode into full national controversies: reservations and special political representation for backward classes. To the comfortable, this sounds dangerous. To those who have never seen one of their own in a position of authority, it sounds like the first breath after drowning. Lohia is ruthless even with his own allies. He tells self-proclaimed socialists from dominant castes, if your wedding guest lists and your children's marriages follow the old rules of caste purity, don't you dare lecture the nation on equality. He calls out the hypocrisy of leaders who embrace temple entry movements in public, but refuse to share a meal with a Dalit comrade in private. These are not abstract debates in some rarefied salon. They are fights that split local organizations, break friendships, and make him, in many districts, either deeply loved or intensely hated. All the while, the clock is ticking. Nehru's image is still towering, unshaken. Congress dominance looks permanent. Lohia's Socialist Party struggles with fractures and limited resources. In 1952, 1955, 1957, splits and mergers come in waves. The Socialist Party merges into the Praja Socialist Party. Then Lohia himself breaks away in 1955 to rebuild an independent socialist party once more, tired of what he sees as drift and compromise. To ordinary citizens, it sometimes looks like the socialists cannot stop quarreling even among themselves. To Lohia, this internal knife-fighting is the messy cost of keeping an honest line in a dishonest world. But the risk is real. Time can turn even the noblest critic into a joke if he never shows results. The first brutal twist comes from a place no one expected: the icy, remote heights of the Himalayas. 1962, the Sino-Indian War. For years, Nehru has spoken of Hindi Chini bye-bye, of Asian solidarity, of peaceful coexistence. The Chinese attack smashes that dream in a matter of weeks. Indian troops, poorly equipped and badly led, fall back in confusion and tragedy. Newspapers that once printed Nehru's speeches like scripture now carry grim maps of retreat. The unshakable leader suddenly looks fallible. Lohia does not celebrate. He is no nationalist hawk hungry for war. The human cost horrifies him. Soldiers without proper coats in mountain snow are not an argument. They are an accusation. But he seizes the political crack this disaster has opened. He attacks not the Jawans, but the system that sent them unprepared. He raises with renewed intensity his old charges, a centralized, top-heavy state that confuses grand rhetoric with actual readiness, a ruling elite more comfortable in drawing rooms than in barracks or villages. Nehru, aging, weighed down by grief and responsibility, suddenly finds that the critics he once brushed aside as marginal are now being heard. Lohia decides that the time has come to transform symbolic rivalry into a direct duel. In the 1962 general elections, he does something many consider political suicide. He stands against Nehru himself in Phulpur. Nehru, as home constituency, the safest of safe seats, the sanctified ground of the first prime minister, the result is never seriously in doubt. Nehru wins, and by a large margin. But something else, harder to measure and more dangerous in the long run, has happened. For the first time, millions of Indians see that Nehru can be challenged not by some royal prince or communal demagogue, but by a man whose entire life has been spent in the trenches of the freedom struggle. A man who can stand on the same stage and say, without trembling, "We fought the British together. Today I fight you, not because you were wrong then, but because you are wrong now." The clock ticks louder. Soon after, in 1963, a by-election in Farrukhabad finally sends Lohia to the Lok Sabha. Now he has a microphone again, and this time it cannot be turned off easily. Parliament, under his voice, becomes a theater of confrontation. He attacks the government not only on ideology, but with excruciatingly concrete details. He compares the daily spending on a cow in a government cowshed with the daily spending on a prisoner in a jail, and then with what the state effectively spends per day on a poor villager's education and health. He points out, in rupees and pays, the obscene gap between a senior officer's salary and a peon's wage, between what is spent on a minister's bungalow lawn and on a school's midday meal. He has a brutal, unforgettable phrase for it: a high-cost state for a low-income people. On women's rights, he slices through tokenism with a single demand: equal pay for equal work, and not in some distant utopia, but now written into law. He mocks a parliament that claims to worship Bharat Mata, but pays her daughters half wages. Outside the House, he throws himself into mass agitations that terrify a government unused to real street opposition. In the mid-1960s, as prices of basic goods shoot up, food, cloth, kerosene, he launches fierce anti-price rise campaigns. Factories, offices, colleges, and markets become arenas of protest. Railway lines are blocked, jails begin to fill, and Jail Baro Andalan stops being a slogan and becomes a logistical problem for the Home Ministry. Newspapers, once content to carry only Congress voices, are forced to report an uncomfortable fact. A parallel language of politics is taking shape, one that talks less about diplomatic conferences and more about the price of rice in the bazaar. It is during this period that Lohia formulates some of his most far-reaching ideas, distilled in what he calls the 7 revolutions, against inequality between man and woman, between caste and caste, between rich and poor, between race and race, between country and country, against private and public violence, against mental slavery, 7 axes along which he believes true freedom must be fought, simultaneously, relentlessly. For Nehru's government, this is infuriating. They are not ruled by fools or villains. They are building roads, factories, institutes of technology. They are debated in world capitals as pioneers of non-alignment. And yet here is this thin, sharp-tongued socialist accusing them again and again of betraying the revolution. It becomes personal. Nehru, once indulgent, begins to show flashes of irritation in Parliament when Lohia speaks. Lohia, once carefully respectful, starts naming Nehru directly as the architect of an unequal order. The rivalry is now out in the open, in the record, in Hansard-style transcripts that future historians will mine like dynamite. But history has one more twist prepared, and it explodes with surgical cruelty in 1964. Jawaharlal Nehru dies. For a moment, the country stands still. Crowds line the streets, weeping openly as the body of the man who embodied Indian independence for so many is carried to the funeral pyre. Radio stations play somber music. Commentators speak of the end of an era. For Lohia, the moment is emotionally complex in a way he barely admits. He has lost not just a rival but a fellow soldier from the freedom struggle, a man whose courage against the British he has never doubted, even while attacking his post-independence choices with venom. Politically, the landscape is transformed overnight. The giant is gone, but the giant's shadow remains. The Congress Party machine, the habits of obedience, the belief that power in Delhi naturally belongs to one formation. And time for Lohia is running faster than ever. He is in his mid-50s, but his body feels older. Prison, hunger strikes, endless travel, they have left their mark. He has heart troubles, bouts of exhaustion. Doctors advise rest. He laughs in their faces. There is, in his mind, a clear, merciless deadline. The next general elections due in 1967. If by then the Congress is still as mighty as before, even without Nehru, the message will be unmistakable. India has not just loved one leader. It has accepted one-party rule as the natural order of things. He decides on a strategy that will define his last great phase, non-congressism. The idea is brutally simple and therefore shocking. He calls on all opposition forces, socialists, Janasangh, regional parties, even groups he once despised, to set aside their ideological wars for a while and unite on one principle: defeat the Congress, break its monopoly, open the arteries of democracy. To purists, this smells like betrayal. To Lohia, it smells like survival, not his own, but that of the Republic. He travels like a man possessed. From Kerala to Bihar, from Uttar Pradesh to Mysore, he moves ceaselessly, stitching together improbable alliances. In one town, he shares a platform with a right-wing leader whose economic views he loathes. In another, he embraces a peasant organizer whose religious ideas he finds superstitious. He does it deliberately, publicly, defiantly. First, he says, let us end one-party rule. Then we can fight each other in the open, as equals. In back rooms thick with cigarette smoke and cheap tea, fragile coalitions are born. State-level leaders, too long in the shadow of the Congress High Command, begin to imagine themselves in actual power. The Congress laughs. At first, these coalitions look impossible, like rope woven from water. Old enemies are expected to work together, ideological foes to share a cabinet. It seems the stuff of wishful fantasies, but underneath the ground is shifting. Prices have risen. Corruption scandals have begun to leak. The war with Pakistan in 1965 has left fresh scars. In villages, the Green Revolution has not yet delivered, and in cities, unemployed youth simmer. Lohia's bitter mocking phrase, "Congress is a party of the haves ruling in the name of the have-nots," starts to bite. 1967 approaches like a storm on the horizon. Election posters bloom on dusty walls. Loudspeakers on jeeps crackle with promises and accusations. Congress candidates still boast of the freedom struggle, of Nehru's legacy. Opposition candidates talk about ration lines, about landlord brutality, about jobs that never came. Lohia, frailer now, pushes himself beyond exhaustion. He collapses briefly during a campaign, chest tight, breath ragged. Friends beg him to slow down, to remember he is not 30 anymore. He waves them away, eyes blazing. If we do not break them now, when will we? As voting day nears, even hardened policemen admit they have never seen such a strange, electric, unpredictable election. And somewhere in a small, cluttered room surrounded by notes, maps, and anxious comrades, Ram Manohar Lohia waits, not for his own victory, but for an answer to the only question that has driven him since the flag was raised in 1947. Can this country, born from a revolution against an empire, finally learn to rebel against its own rulers? The results that will begin to answer that question are only days away. Time, his oldest enemy, his closest companion, is almost out. The night the political map of India finally begins to crack, Ram Manohar Lohia is not surrounded by ministers and bodyguards. He is hunched over a cheap radio set in a cramped room, coughing, his chest tight, a glass of water gone warm on the table. Outside, 1967 crackles. Election results trickle in like nervous telegrams from a distant battlefield. In one district after another, the unthinkable starts to appear on blackboards and in newspaper offices. Congress, defeated. Seats it had held since independence, lost. Chief ministers who walked like viceroys through their capitals, suddenly jobless. For nearly 20 years, India has voted as if there is only one natural party of power, Tonight, that habit is breaking, and at the heart of that break sits this thin, exhausted socialist who refused to believe that history moves only in one direction. For Ram Manohar Lohia, the clock that has been ticking in his head for years is reaching zero. He listens as reporters shout updates over clattering typewriters. In Uttar Pradesh, the Congress tally plunges. In Bihar, it sinks below a majority. In Punjab, in West Bengal, in Odisha, combinations of oppositions, improbable, quarrelsome, stitched together with spit and willpower, are overtaking the old giant. In the middle of this storm, another number arrives, one that concerns him personally, Kannauj. A dusty constituency in Uttar Pradesh, of traders and peasants, of narrow lanes and sprawling fields. Lohia has fought there on a shoestring campaign, sleepless, ignoring his doctor's warnings, telling crowds that this election is not about replacing one ruler with another, but about cracking open the system itself. The verdict comes. He has won. The room erupts. Comrades shout, embrace, slap each other's backs. Someone begins to chant his name. He smiles, but it is thin, almost distracted, because for him this is not a crowning, it is a deadline. Non-Congressism has done what almost no one thought possible. In state after state, the Congress has lost its monopoly. Fragile coalitions, Samyukta Vidayak Dals, United Legislators Fronts, begin to form governments. But Lohia knows that removing an old ruler is only the opening act. The true test is whether the new ones can behave differently. Time, merciless as always, will not give him years to find out. He throws himself into the second phase of his gamble. There is no pause for rest, no victory holiday in the hills. Within days, he is on trains again, moving between Lucknow, Patna, Chandigarh, Calcutta, sitting in rooms thick with sweat and suspicion. Legislators who once shouted at each other across ideological trenches now sit around the same wooden tables, sharing chipped cups of tea, staring uneasily at this man who has convinced them that their enemies are, for the moment, elsewhere. He looks from face to face, Janasang conservatives, socialists, peasant leaders, regional satraps, and lays down the ground rule. With blunt force, you have not been elected to become a new Congress. You have been elected to prove that power can look, sound, and act differently. In Uttar Pradesh, he encourages a government led by Charan Singh, a tough-talking farmers' leader. In Bihar, he nudges together a coalition of socialists and caste-oppressed groups. In other states, he sends emissaries, advice, warnings. He refuses office for himself. No cabinet post, no chief minister's chair, no limousine with a fluttering flag. He chooses to remain outside, agitator, critic, architect of pressure. To many, this is madness. After decades in the wilderness, after prison and ridicule, after losing to Nehru in Phulpur, here he is at last in a position to take a slice of real power, and he walks away from it. But for Lohia, stepping into the executive would feel like stepping into quicksand. Once you sit behind a desk, the logic of the desk takes over. Files, protocols, constraints, the gentle, lethal language of later. He wants to keep shouting now. His rivalry since Nehru's death has changed shape. It is no longer one man versus another. It is one idea of politics, controlled from Delhi, dressed in English, staffed by the same narrow social elites, versus another, scrappy, regional, loud, full of accents, full of the people whose names were always at the bottom of the list. And yet, as these non-Congress governments take office, he watches with a knot in his gut how quickly old habits slip into new clothes. In one state, the new ministers rush to allocate official bungalows and red beacon cars. In another, caste equations, always just beneath the surface, explode as soon as portfolios are distributed. In assembly lobbies, the same brokers who once whispered in Congress ears now hover near the newcomers. The danger he has warned about for years begins to appear before his eyes. The structure stays, only the occupants change. He responds with the only weapons he knows, words and movement. He publicly scolds chief ministers who indulge in ceremony while price rises burn through their states. He demands immediate steps on land redistribution, on reservations for backward classes, on equal pay for women in government jobs. He reminds them again and again that they are on trial. You have at most 5 years, he tells a nervous group of young MLAs one night. Maybe less. If you turn into little Congresses, the people will throw you out, and they will be right. 5 years. He says it like a sentence handed down by a judge. In truth, his own personal clock may be set even shorter. His body has been sending alarm signals for months, crushing fatigue, sharp pains, trouble passing urine. Friends plead with him to check into a hospital to undergo the operation that doctors insist is necessary. He postpones, reschedules, shrugs. "How can I lie in a bed," he snaps, "when the country is finally starting to stand up?" The cost of that defiance will arrive with surgical precision. By late 1967, the strain becomes impossible to ignore. In Delhi, he finally agrees, reluctantly, to be admitted to Willingdon Hospital, a British-era building of stone corridors and the smell of antiseptic, the kind of institution he is often mocked as a symbol of colonial hangover. He jokes weekly with comrades at his bedside about the irony. Ram Manohar Lohia, the enemy of elite English, is being surrounded by signboards in flawless administrative English. The diagnosis is clear: a prostate condition that requires surgery. There is, for the first time in his life, a clock ticking that no speech, no agitation, no election can change. The timer of a human body at the edge of its limits. On October 7, 1967, surgeons wheel him into the operating theater. Bright lights, cold metal, masks bending over him. He has lived his adult life in the arena of public struggle, his words echoing in streets and parliaments. Now his fate will be decided in the hushed choreography of a hospital room. The operation seems at first to go well, but complications, infection, shock, set in. Outside, his supporters pace the corridors, murmuring prayers, trading rumors. Politicians from across the spectrum send messages, some sincere, some calculating. For all his enemies, there is no denying his place in the story of the Republic. For 5 days, he hangs between life and death. On October 12th, the news slips out of the ward and into the city. Ram Manohar Lohia is gone, 57 years old, just months after he helped break the one-party spell. In an instant, the man who seemed always in motion becomes a still point in history. Crowds gather as his body is taken for cremation. Farmers who had walked miles to hear him speak now walk again, silently, to say goodbye. Students who had shouted his slogans stand stunned, eyes red, wondering who will now give words to their anger. Members of the very Congress. He spent his life battling pay tribute in Parliament, calling him a fearless patriot, a tireless socialist. The speeches sound respectful, sometimes even sincere, and also, to those who knew him well, faintly unreal, because they know something that the official obituaries will not say aloud. Lohia died in the middle of a war he had only just begun to win. There is no great office to his name, no towering monument in the center of the capital, no massive personal fortune, no political dynasty bearing his surname. He leaves behind ideas, arguments, bruised friendships, embattled parties, and a set of questions sharp enough to cut through decades. The hospital where he breathed his last will in time be renamed after him, Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital. It is a small, strange justice in a city that once pretended not to hear him, but his real afterlife will not unfold in stone and brass. It will unfold in the messy, unpredictable terrain of Indian politics long after his ashes have cooled. The first echoes come surprisingly quickly. In the early 1970s, as discontent grows against a centralizing Congress now led by Indira Gandhi, students and workers in Bihar and Gujarat pour onto the streets. Corruption, inflation, authoritarian habits, the list of grievances grows. A new figure steps into the role of moral leader, Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, once Lohia's comrade, now the voice of a mass movement. His rallies shake Patna. His speeches call for total revolution. Inside those words, anyone who knows the genealogy of ideas can hear Lohia's 7 revolutions beating like a hidden drum against caste, class, gender inequality, against the violence of the state, against mental slavery. Many of the young organizers running between campuses and villages, dodging Lathis, will later admit they cut their political teeth on Lohia's pamphlets. When Indira Gandhi declares the emergency in 1975, suspending civil liberties, jailing opponents, censoring the press, the full meaning of Lohia's warnings about one-party dominance and centralized power becomes brutal reality. Jails fill again, just as they did under the British, but now with freedom fighters' children and grandchildren. 2 years later, in 1977, when the emergency is lifted and elections are held, an unprecedented coalition of opposition forces sweeps the Congress out of power at the center for the first time. Socialists, Jana Sangh cadres, Gandhians, regional leaders, They all crowd into one ungainly, quarrelsome vehicle, the Janata Party. On dusty walls and in campaign speeches across North India, a familiar name resurfaces, Lohia. The phrase non-congressism suddenly sounds less like a curious theory and more like the hidden manual everyone has been secretly following. It is as if a man who died a decade earlier has slipped a note into the pocket of history. When they become too strong, combine. Don't argue about everything. First, break their monopoly. The Janata experiment will not last. Old rivalries, ambitions, ideological divides tear it apart within a few years. But the breach in Congress dominance is now permanent. The idea that one party has a natural divine right to rule India has been buried, and Ram Manohar Lohia is one of the men who dug the grave. His other rebellions continue their long, difficult journeys. On caste, his impact is even more explosive, though it takes time for the fuse to reach the gunpowder. Through the 1980s and 1990s, new leaders rise in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, men from castes that rarely touched power before, Mulayam, Singh Yadav, Lalu Prasad Yadav, Nitish Kumar. They speak the language of social justice, of dignity for the backward classes, of reservations and representation. Many of them call themselves Lohiates. They quote his speeches against upper caste domination. They hang his portrait in party offices and government buildings, garlanded with marigolds. They name schemes and roads after him. When the Mandal Commission's recommendations for reservations for other backward classes are implemented in 1990, India erupts. In some cities, upper caste students burn copies of the report and stage dramatic protests. In others, young men and women from backward castes celebrate like a dam has finally burst. The television cameras, now everywhere, capture the clash of futures. Few mention Lohia on the primetime debates, but in the quieter corners, among old socialists in dingy libraries and the memories of earlier agitations, there is a recognition. This convulsion is the delayed shockwave of an argument he began under banyan trees in the 1950s. He had said bluntly that without a real share of power for the oppressed castes, democracy would remain a photograph, the pose, of equality without the substance. The photograph is now being torn and redrawn in public. And yet, like every legacy, his is not simple, not pure. Some of the politicians who claim his heritage use caste not as a ladder toward equality, but as a fortress for their own clans. They speak in his name while building palaces, distributing tickets to relatives, turning parties into personal fiefdoms. They repeat his criticisms of English, but send their children to elite English medium schools. They talk of women's empowerment and then pack cabinets and party posts with men. In these distortions, the old Lohia would have recognized a familiar enemy, hypocrisy dressed as progress. His ideas on women, equal pay, dismantling patriarchal customs, remain, even decades after his death, more radical than many party manifestos. His insistence that every revolution must include women not as symbols but as equal agents is still a demand, not a reality. On language, the battle he started continues in subtler ways. Parliament now hears far more Hindi and regional languages than in his time. State assemblies buzz with Marathi, Tamil, Bengali, Kannada. Government forms, railway announcements, street signs have spread into multiple tongues. And yet, in the commanding heights of the economy, in corporate boardrooms, in elite courts, in the best colleges, English still sits like a gate that must be passed. The peasant with the petition that Lohia once described so vividly has a cousin now. The young graduate rejected from a job interview, not because he lacks knowledge, but because his English carries the wrong accent, the wrong confidence. The problem he raged against has not disappeared. It has simply moved, changed costume, found new justifications. In Delhi, policy think tanks occasionally host conferences on Lohia's relevance today, where academics present papers on his sevens, revolutions, his critique of the high-cost state, his analysis of imperialism and neo-colonialism. In small towns, bus stops still bear his name. In universities, a new generation discovers grainy photographs of a bespectacled man with an intense gaze, standing at rickety podiums, and making jokes sharp enough to make ministers wince. And in every election season, in every coalition negotiation, his ghost hovers, in the instinctive understanding that in India, no party can safely assume it rules alone forever. His rivalry with Nehru, which once looked like a personal duel, now reads differently from the distance of decades. It begins to look less like the clash of two men and more like the clash of two models. A top-down planned elite-led modernization that trusts time and growth to dissolve old injustices, versus a restless, bottom-up, impatient revolution that wants to drag those injustices screaming into the center of public life now, even if it makes everyone uncomfortable. India, in the end, did not choose one over the other. It chose both, in different doses at different times, sometimes paying heavily for each. The towering dams and steel plants Nehru loved exist alongside the waves of caste assertion and regional empowerment that bear Lohia's fingerprints. The English-speaking bureaucrat and the vernacular-speaking chief minister jostle in the same news bulletin. The story is unfinished. If you walk today into Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital in Delhi, the corridors are still crowded. Patients from villages clutching plastic files, nurses weaving through gurneys, announcements echoing in multiple languages. On a wall, his photograph looks down, a man forever in mid-sentence. Outside, somewhere in India, a young activist is arguing that her village deserves a road, a school, a share of power. A student is challenging caste prejudice in his college. A workers' union is demanding equal pay for women. A small regional party is bargaining hard in a coalition, refusing to bow before a central command. Most of them have never read Lohia in the original. Many may not even know his name beyond a passing mention. But they are walking through the door he spent his life kicking at. The man who raced against time, who chose rivalry over comfort, who forced a newly independent country to look in the mirror and see not just the face of its former rulers, but the shadows of its own injustices. That man did not live to watch his revolutions ripen. He left early, mid-fight, trusting that once a question has been asked loudly enough, it cannot be buried again. His life, messy and uncompromising, ends not with a coronation but with a challenge that still hangs in the air, waiting to be taken. Freedom from foreign rule was the first victory. Who will complete the rest?